Everybody, Kris Kelly will teach us today about how to avoid surprise defects.
Awesome.
Kris Kelly, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm Kris Kelly, CEO of Advantu. We're a medical device engineering services and regulatory support company. We basically help medical device manufacturers get products to market safely and low cost. And how we avoid surprise defects is by showing people how to reveal the blind spots in the medical device, or really any software. I'm going to minimize Joe's screen so I'm not looking at your face. What is the challenge? Well, if you think about complex systems, they require what I call targeted creative destruction, because you have to consider the inherent mission critical risks. For example, airlines. Think about every time you get on an airplane, how many systems on that craft have to work perfectly. There can't be any failures or any downtime so that you can make it all the way to where you want to go safely every time you get on a plane. There's a lot. Automotive, they're becoming increasingly complex, operated by humans worldwide. And if you think about this, if you're a car manufacturer, the requirement of entry is that you get a driver's license. You're not trained as a sports car driver. You're not trained on how to deal with failures while you're driving. You just get a license and off you go. Medical devices. This equipment is expected to operate reliably and continuously at the most crucial aspect of a person's life. They're in the hospital or under distress. They're expecting a doctor and the equipment to save them. So think about that. So what are the problems? Well, regardless of industry, critical defects continually escape to production. For example, airlines. We saw over the last, I think, 5, 6, 7 years, 2 planes went down. Nobody knew why. And they, of course, thought, well, pilot error, or maybe the pilot was suicidal. It took 2 planes to go down before they decided to go take another look, and they determined it was a flight control software glitch. Not good. Another one, automotive, airbag deployment failures. They have been building and deploying airbags in cars since the mid-1970s. I remember reading a story about a woman that walked away from an accident. She was driving an old 75 Cadillac Eldorado. And believe it or not, she drove through the barrier at a train crossing and slammed into the side of a freight train. But it was a giant car. So because of the airbags, which she didn't even know were in the car, she's able to walk away. So we know that they were designing these things to save lives. Then, of course, medical devices. Look at all the product failures that end up in the news all the time, and it doesn't end. It's over and over and over. So regardless of the industry, there are unexpected failures everywhere. Now, later in my presentation, I'm going to revert back to this hot example. Think about cybersecurity. It affects every industry and every part of your life. Your identity is hacked. People take over home monitoring systems, security systems. They hack in. They look what's in your house. They know when you're there, when you're not. It's around the world. Now think about when those folks built that system at your house to have a camera so you can see what's going on in your house remotely. They built the security for it thinking like normal people. In other words, when they build these systems and they design it to operate the way it was designed, and they sell it that way because they think, well, who would do that? Who would think of something dangerous? Why would someone behave that way? So think about that. So why do these problems keep happening? First, hidden risks are difficult to identify. And second, teams don't know where to look. And if you're an engineer out there, this is probably going to bug you, and it bugged me too the first time I figured this out. First off, most teams are deadline driven. Got to be first to market, right? And then again, you've got the cost of looking for hidden defects. It's believed to be too high. It's going to, they're thinking it's going to eat into their profits. Then of course, there's just on these R&D teams, there's a distinct lack of understanding of how to reveal the blind spots in the code. And of course, as we've all seen, industries wait until repeated critical failures to think out of the box. And this is where that out of the box is the sweet spot for this. Now, there are 2 main culprits of what I call surprise defects. There's unexpected user actions and abnormal system behavior. So it's, for example, in a hospital setting, you're in the ER, there's a patient that comes in, they're having a heart attack, there's something seriously wrong with them. They want to give either, they used to give, I think it was adrenaline or something they would deliver to a patient with a heart problem to save their life. This nurse is fighting this infusion pump and she's trying to make it do something it wasn't designed to do, maybe bolus a little stronger, a little longer to save this person's life. The pump wasn't designed to work that way, so it stops working, patient dies. Abnormal system behavior. You create this medical device, it's passed everything, it's got the 510K, it's passed all the testing, It's in the hospital. You then connect it to the hospital system that they're going to do the billing, security. So there's a lot of hospital systems that your medical device may or may not have to interact with. And if you haven't tested against those systems, you could have an issue like one of the ones had with Cerner, where they were collecting data and it was going back and forth between a certain hospital system, medical device, and this was to collect data for billing. And there was a glitch in the Cerner system, which caused several hospital systems, medical devices to crash. Imagine that, because nobody tested for it, because nobody thought it would happen. Nobody took the time to think, what if that happens? Here we go. This is a perfect example of a most recent medical device recall. And those of you that are in the industry, you know that you can check the FDA site, and there's a list of recalls that goes back decades, and it's updated every week. Now, I've been watching this for years, and so here's a perfect example. Here's this pump that they use for patients that are suffering from cardiac, they require cardiac and respiratory support. Here's this pump, home use. During use at home, the system had a problem because if you read the reason for recall, the controller's monitoring feature may erroneously detect frozen or unresponsive software and trigger the device to enter a critical failure mode. Now imagine you're sitting there with this pump, you need this to work, and if you took the time when you bought the product to read the instructions on how to recover from a pump failure, if you don't follow these instructions specifically and in time, the pump may stop working. Obviously it did, people died. Now there's a solution, and a lot of you that have been in the industry, you're going to see FMEA and go, hey, I've seen that before, I know what that is, we use this already. Well, not exactly. Failure mode and effects analysis is basically a way of looking at things from out of the box. Now, back in, must have been 2008, 2009, I was asked to come up and lead a test team for a company up in LA, where at the time, 75% of all credit card transactions in North America went through their system. So you can imagine everything from like Sears to mom and pop stores to every gas stations, all kinds of businesses. Think about all those credit card transactions that happen every second in this country. Well, because this company was growing and they wanted to account for performance so that there were no delays to the system, they needed to upgrade the back end. So they're replacing a Microsoft SQL system and all the related technology with Oracle SQL and all of its related technology. Now, when I went up to meet the team, there was a meeting with the CEO and the entire company. And he wanted to let everybody know that when we do this process, because of all the high risk to this mission critical system, they don't want any customers anywhere in North America to even know what happened. They shouldn't feel it. They shouldn't be inconvenienced. Everything should continue to work as always. So to make sure that happened, they brought in KPMG to take the lead on the risk. And that was where I learned how this process can be applied to finding defects that are hidden in the code. And after days of sitting in wall-to-wall white room rooms set up for it, these folks from KPMG walked us through this entire process. And they literally walked us through the system before and after, and they highlighted all the risks. It was visual, it was all logic-oriented. I had never seen anything like it, and it was just blown away. And the beauty is, because I was the QA lead, they gave me the package and said, here you go, boom, this is for you. You're going to want to know how this works. It was breathtaking, and it literally changed my career. So here's the history. If you look on Wikipedia.
So, hold on, it literally changed your career? Why do you say it literally changed your career?
I had been in test at that point for about 10 years, and I had taken all the different courses that Carnegie Mellon provides, Sticky Minds. There's a lot of institutions where if you get into testing, you want to learn how to become better at it. You take the courses, you read the books, you basically learn how to professionally test software. And I thought I had been fully trained and knew everything there was to know up until I got to this project. And when they showed us this approach, it completely changed how I approach testing. And I realized that I was missing things. I just was unaware of it.
I'd like to ask Dr. Bohorquez to come off mute and tell us about any of this, how you relate to this type of testing related to your electrical engineering PhD.
Yeah, no, I mean, FMEA is probably the most commonly and favorite tool for use when evaluating risk, right? So it just gives you a very systematic means of looking at what are the various failure modes, like what's the probability that this failure mode occurs? If it occurs, what's the injury that could happen, or the harm, or the bad thing? And then if that happens, what's the severity of that? And So being methodical and systematic about it, I mean, it's just a really good tool for evaluating. Yeah.
Maren, do you have any FMEA stories to tell when you were over working on defibrillators?
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of them, and it's really anytime you're doing risk management, whether it's an FMEA, which is looking at more detailed, or a hazard analysis, approaching it in a methodical way, there's the word, really make sure that you have everything covered. I found out recently when I was talking to an FMEA geek that you actually have to tweak the standard FMEA process a little bit for compliance with 14971. But the basic process is absolutely solid, and it makes a difference. And you can use it at the user needs level when you're looking at scenarios and user issues. You can use it at the product level, and you can use it at the very detailed design level. So it's a really powerful tool.
For those of us playing along at home, remind us 14971 is the one that what?
14971 is the medical risk management procedure. And it has some certain types of risks that to consider that really aren't covered in the FMEA process. But the FMEA process has some addition, or the FMEA standard, let me say that, has some additional things that they look at as well. So, you can combine the FMEA standard with the 14971 or the risk management procedure.
Okay.
And Michelle's just posted an FDA risk workshop. So there's a lot of really good data
and
out on it.
Before I forget, Maren, I can do Tuesday or Wednesday lunch. I know, off topic. Michelle Lott.
So ironically, because I'm checking my emails, and FDA on November 15th is having a 2-hour risk workshop to talk about the application of risk management in medical devices.
Next week, Bijan is talking to us about risk, and those, I know, Luke, you bought his 700-page tome on risk. So for those of you who are, you can invite your FMEA geek friends, Maren. Next week, they'll be all over it. Rick Stockton, you had a comment?
Yeah, no, the most interesting thing about FMEA creation, which is something that I do, is working the team efficiently. Because usually you're getting some of your highest paid technical people and quality people together in one room, burning up all of those hours. So one of the most interesting recent things I did with an automotive company here in town was to develop a method to utilize their time to the max and then collate and organize a lot of the information in the background while they didn't have to be there. And then we'd meet later in the week to clean it up. And so they had been working for several weeks, locking themselves in a meeting room for days, for days on end, using up all that time and denying their company all of their resource. And I was able to knock this out in about 3 weeks of 1-hour meetings, 2 times a week. And so a lot of times what they were finding was that the quality of their information was diminishing rapidly with the excess time they had to devote to it. And so we were able to get all of the information that we needed and be able to deal with all of the risk factors and satisfy all the requirements in a much smaller amount of time. So even though it shouldn't theoretically be this way, the amount of time that it takes to extract that data from the people who know most about the product has a lot to do with the final results. Even though obviously we should all be trying 100% all the time, doing everything exactly right, the time does wear people down. So,
I could ask David and Michael and Yuha stories too, but Kris, why don't you take us back? And thanks everyone for that conversation.
Thanks, Joe, for asking that question, because boy, they sure made my case better than I could. Here we go. Why would we use this? And SB means scenario based. That's to me the secret sauce. I noticed on multiple, at least medical device projects, and I've seen it in other industries as well, but especially the FDA, because it's so highly regulated, it's a check the box mentality. And from a test perspective, it was apparent to me because it's kind of like, okay, you're given an excuse. And what I mean by that is FDA created all these regulations. This company created all their SOPs. They have all their processes in place. all you got to do is follow them and then you're done, right? So hazard analysis, check. All the way down the line, you check all these boxes. And from a test perspective, you're doing everything you're expected to do. You dry run the test cases while you're making them. You get the reviews, you get the feedback, you update them, check. And then you get the run for record. That's nothing but formal testing. When all the test cases have been created, you've basically fully verified and validated the system, and you believe it's ready to ship. So then you execute run for record. You execute all the test cases. They all have to pass. The ones that are minor, you can get deviations, but they all pass. And everybody goes, we're done. Because in the test world, when managers would come up and say, okay, how do we know when it's ready to test? Then I would show them a graph. When the critical defects that we find, that reporting, that graph goes down to 0. There's no more critical defects. Maybe there's a couple of trivial ones, but it's safe, it's ready to go. And that FDA world, it seemed like it's even exaggerated because, again, here's this box. You do everything that they tell you to do, and you should be good to go. So when your run for record testing passes, everybody kind of goes, a few people go, God, I can't believe it passed. But you think you're done. You've done everything like you're supposed to do, and then you ship it, right? So why are so many medical devices recalled, routinely? Again, it comes down to checking the boxes. But what I noticed was when you start to get short on time, the big thing they want to make sure was, okay, we worked with quality, we worked with systems engineering, we worked with marketing, all the hazards and risks have been determined. They've all been, we've done our testing in accordance with what they came up with. And what I've noticed with most of them like to write happy path tests, meaning they want to prove that it works. And it's very few people that I've found that come in with the approach of what I call creative destruction. You've got the software engineers that are building the product. They're relying on you on the test side to utilize creative destruction, find every way possible to break that software so they can then strengthen it and make it as robust as possible. But if you're only testing to prove that it works, you're not really helping them. But that seems to be what most people do. And then they have, well, we've done negative testing. It's a handful of negative tests. And then there's ad hoc testing. I saw multiple times companies I worked for, right before a product would go out, they would do a bug bash session. They'd bring everybody in the company into the lab, have it all set up, script set up, and then people would go through and just randomly beat up the system. And then they would fix whatever that was, run another regression, out the door. Again, very poorly planned, if at all, because it's outside the box. And of course, there's no training on it. It's just what the FDA has in place, right? Like your test plan, your test cases, it's all reviewed, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, management is routinely pressured to keep the project on time. And as you get closer and closer to the promised release date, say from a program manager or VP promised to a favorite customer, you can't miss that date. So you tend to rush things and you cut corners. And I noticed most of the corner cutting was in negative testing. Well, all the test cases passed, we should be good to go. Again, when you come in and try to come with a different approach to testing to try to break the product, they look at it and go, well, you've already done the testing that the FDA said you're supposed to do. Let's ship it because you're taking too much time. So now I'm going to walk through a project where I wanted to utilize this approach. I was brought in, as I mentioned to Joe a while ago, when I started Advantu, I had a software testing company years before in the past, and I wanted to get back into the business. So I went ahead and took a contract at CareFusion that make medical device infusion pumps amongst many items, because I knew I couldn't sell software testing in an industry as regulated as this without understanding the entire FDA wrapper, all of the compliance aspects. So I tell people that the 2.5 years I spent at CareFusion was my PhD on FDA compliance. So long story short, they had a new system that they were building where it was marrying a hospital system where the nurses could identify all the devices and all the wards and check the health. Yep, that one's running, it's infusing, here's the infusion rate. That means that patient hopefully is still alive. So you're marrying this dashboard to, at the time, these different, what they call docking stations. And I'm not revealing anything that's it's IP or anything, but it's just a stand that you attach the medical device to, like an infusion pump. So they were marrying this system network to approximately 500 of these docking stations. Each could hold about 10 pumps. So now you think about the scale of that, right? And to me, I saw the potential for things going wrong after this thing was shipped. So I went to the director of software engineering, mentioned my experience with this process, and asked if I could utilize it. And God bless him, he said, yes, go ahead. So under his authority. And like Joe and other folks were saying, getting this team together for this to work, and I saw it at the project ended up in LA, you have to have all the key members of the team, of the project team, in on this initial process. So we set up a room, whiteboards, and I brought in folks from technical writing, pretty much everybody that was on the project team, marketing, quality, of course, R&D, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody was in this room, and I had them for exactly 6 hours. I forget the gentleman's name. I mentioned the cost per hour, every one of these people, which is why I was limited to 6 hours. And then I walked them through the process. And because this system was being married and had never been done before, tons of risk, right? So basically, I laid out everything on the board of the key functionality and features based upon the requirements, and then just walked them through and said, okay, how's this being implemented? For example, for this feature, for the nurse decided to do this, what would that cause, et cetera, et cetera. What I found was really interesting as I walked through all the requirements, right, that had just been approved. As I was going through the requirements and talking about certain key functionality and features to get their feedback, and if somebody did this, what would happen? I started to see that marketing and software engineering started to debate. And it was funny because marketing wrote the requirements, right? And then they take the feedback from the team. And when the engineering folks were getting ready to start coding the project, it was funny because they were going, wait a minute, I thought when you wrote the requirement to do this, I thought you meant that. So that's how I coded it. And marketing was like, no, 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 no. When I said this, I meant that. So that aspect alone saved a lot of mistakes. It was a lot of cleanup. It was kind of funny. But walking them through the process, one by one, I started to see all the folks that were, this isn't going to work. What a waste of my time. One by one, people started to go, oh, we should try that. Well, what if that happened? And the ideas, because I picked one person from, tech support, quality, regulatory, R&D, marketing, project management. I made sure everybody contributed, because that old saying, none of us is as smart as all of us, really applies here. So we spent that 6 hours walking through this system, and logically, we walked them through all the potential danger and defect areas, and they started to see it. I had a whiteboard on the far right of the room saying, okay, unexpected user interaction or abnormal system behavior. And we started to fill that whiteboard. And these are potential defects that would have almost never been found by how they were going to do their V&V, because it was out of the box. It was pretty amazing. And the idea is, as you go through, and the goal is to fill the whiteboard. You're not there to evaluate. It's just take that. Okay, you suggest that, great. And you fill the whiteboard, and they look at it and they go, oh my God, that'll take forever to test. It's like, well, now you have to narrow it down. And as the gentleman mentioned, probability versus impact. And what you want to do is, and we had a 4-square quadrant, which I'll show you in a minute. Basically, after you've listed all the things that could potentially go wrong, and then the subproblems, then you can sit there and go, okay, now, what are the chances this could happen? And if it did happen, what's the impact?
Ms. Lott?
So what time frame, what year range time frame was this?
2015.
Okay. How did all that line up with like all the warning letters that FDA was sending to infusion pump companies and their issuance of those new guidance documents, and particularly the safety assurance case requirements?
Well, I wish I could answer that.
Okay. So you didn't have to jump through the hoops of the safety assurance case.
I did not have to, but I talked to the program manager and the marketing lead afterwards, and they basically walked me through what you just described, because that was all new to me, in the medical device world. But they said, okay, this has to fold into what we're doing, but here's how we can add it in, because it wasn't just like, oh, sure, we're just going to do what you say. We had to work with them to make sure that what we recommended was implemented. And so it was kind of like they had to kind of fold it back into their processes of what you're describing. I was fortunate.
Chris, what percent of Advantu's revenues relate to system testing, software system testing?
About 65%. 7%.
Okay. So if I have just one little thumbtack, like, oh, Kris Kelly, system testing, that would be your preferred?
Sure.
Okay.
If that's all people knew me for, I would be very happy.
Okay. And the other thing that strikes me about your story today is the personalities of the management and the teams and the trade-offs we have to get to market, etc. So I take away Kris Kelly, system testing, but any anecdote you tell is going to be as unique as the company you served at that time with the people that were there. So while you may have, these are the 7 things you have to do, as a function of who's in the room, maybe they don't want to or don't take the time to do them. And then we're in the earlier slides about recalls and stuff. I mean,
yes, it's entirely up to them. And as you're, to go along with this theme, I knew from just having worked with these teams for a few weeks when I started there, and all the different personality types, I knew at least half would go, no way, I don't want anything to do with it. So I had to go right to the director. And if he wasn't going to help me, I was going to go to the VP. I was lucky. It was just a weird part of the world. The VP at the time, he and I both served on the same submarine in 1992. And
that's interesting.
I recognized his name, and then I saw his sub pictures on his office. Like, oh, you were on the USS. I'm not going to go into it, but I said, and you worked with so-and-so and so. And he just looked at me like I was from Mars. Like, how on earth did you know that? And I said, do you remember I was the guy in sonar, blah, blah, blah. And then he was like, oh my God. Yeah. So that was my leverage to get them to tell all these people, you're going to be in this room because this is a mission critical project and you're going to support it. And if we hear you don't, then you're going to work somewhere else. They were serious about it. So yeah, this can be messed with. I mean, you can adjust it per, I would say, if someone's got FMEA experience that really understand risk, then you can adjust it per your industry to match your needs. But I found that when I followed this process that KPMG drilled into us, it was the most effective.
Now, another thing, because one of the things I like to do with these calls is to have everyone in the room appreciate, oh, you're the guy who I should call you for. There are enough people on the call who have worked with, touched, familiar with FMEA. Is the distinction that everyone else FMEA's things that they've worked on, and you can come in later with anything that's been done and test what has happened before? Is that a distinction? And I invite anyone to come off mic and say, actually, no, we do that too, kind of thing. I want to see where the strength in the disciplines are with folks, if anyone has something to contribute. And I'll interpret silence as yes, Kris can drop in on any project and look at what was done before, and the others don't typically take that kind of work.
The other people can say something too, Joe. I was just going to say I get brought in mainly for the clinical risk and the interactions of the risk when there's a failure of some sort. So I'm not into the engineering FMEA creation, but into the interpretation of it from a clinical perspective and all the interactions of things. But then I asked Kris a question real quickly. How does your software, prioritize failure modes according to risk? And then also maybe that you deal about the interactions of risk. How does it address interactions?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, for failure modes, I had to work with, marketing, engineering, et cetera, because they all have their definitions of it. And this was equipment, by the way, that already existed. So they kind of already had all their definitions of failure modes and how the code's supposed to alert the user when there's a problem and things like that. So that was kind of already set in stone. I kind of snuck in under the radar because I didn't walk around talking about FMEA. I just basically told them, hey, this is a scenario-based process that I've used before effectively. And so they kind of just looked at it like, what is he talking about? Because I never mentioned to the team that it was FMEA based or that it was actually that process. So I never really had to deal with that. And I think because I was so new to the medical device world, I was kind of unaware that they would be looking at that as well. I was just basically trying to show them, hey, there's defects. The good news for me was CareFusion they were still coming out of a consent decree. They had lots of problematic products in the market. So they were willing to listen to me. And so that allowed me to say, would you like to figure out how to reveal all the blind spots where all those hidden critical defects are in your systems right now? I can promise you they're there. You just don't know how to expose them. And so their attitude was, okay, smart guys, show us. And that's literally how this all came to be. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It very meets a need out there, but it really isn't involved with prioritization right? Based upon risk. You're just trying to really identify where it can be. Yeah, perfect. That's great. It's an unmet need out there for many companies. So,
well, I hope you boys make time after the call and see what business babies you can make together.
I think one of the things that I see is companies do this risk-based approach. I mean, it's how you make decisions all the way through the design process. Engineers around in a room and they go, well, what would happen if, well, that's a bad thing. So obviously we should decide to do this other thing. Trying to convince people that the majority of their work is actually risk management, and having somebody in the room to just write down those decisions and why they made them all through the process is the hardest piece that I usually find. Most people want to design the device and then they do the risk management without realizing they've been doing risk management all through the process. I do think that the idea of creating the scenarios is really great, because if you're trying to tell a story or walk through a sequence of steps, you're more likely to identify those hidden risks, as Kris talks about, than if you're just kind of picking ideas out of the air without really organizing them. So I think the scenarios is a nice add-on.
This book that I've still not started writing, but I wrote myself a note, maybe I should really start on that. So you want to make a medical device. I know we talk about regulatory and we talk about quality. Does risk management deserve its own subhead, or is risk part of quality?
I think if you're talking about a startup, I think risk deserves its own category. We're talking about, in this context, safety risk or regulatory risk, but you use the same process if it's financial risk. What can happen? How do I sell the product? What happens if my marketing doesn't work, right? Those are risks that you then mitigate. From a manufacturing standpoint, you look at your manufacturing process around it. So this idea of looking at all the parts of your business and thinking what can go wrong and what do I do if that happens is really, it applies generally, not just in the regulatory space.
Yeah,
I'm going to have to get this recording to Bijan so he watches it ahead of next week.
Oh, cool.
So he can build on this. David?
It's all about managing risk. So I put that in your introduction and first chapter, launching your book, and then go into details later on, right?
You know a thing about book sales. How's your book doing so far?
Well, it's really going well. I'm getting pressure now to put out the second volume or second topic kind of thing. And
if you don't mind sharing, like how many downloads or editions are we talking? Because I usually hear about people self-publishing and they sold like 100 or something.
No, it's going real well. It's hit the number one. I shared it with the group. Number one bestseller, number one bestseller, new release in 7 different genres. And it's ranked. They rank them every day. I think it is whatever. So it's hovering around 100 right now of all the Kindles that are available.
Again, I have no sense of what magnitude. Are we talking about 1,000 books sold, 10,000, 1 million? Give us some kind of number.
It's probably since June. It's probably 600. Yes. Okay. So, but it's at a rate that they monitor not only quantity but also rates per day, I think is what it is. At
what level do you have to get before we call you a famous author?
Well, you can call me a famous author with a little f right now, but
there are jokes there that we will ignore. Kris Kelly, take us back, please, before I say something inappropriate.
That was the best comeback. Thank you, David. That was good.
Well, as to a fellow author, I knew you'd appreciate that.
Paul D'Souza, how many books did you move?
6,000.
Wow. So you're a slightly bigger F. And I've always thought of you that way.
I know how bad of an author I am compared to the people I know. That's why
now it's Friday.
Kris, please save me from myself.
You betcha. I forgot who was talking about how certain engineering teams have done this process and they considered it done. When I had that team in the room and I started getting inputs from the marketing folks, and then they had nurses that they had hired to come in. And they came in and said, well, actually, the nurses use it this way, and they use it this way. And it was almost like the engineers had designed the product for them instead of for the actual users, just by that feedback. So it was kind of amazing to me how much they thought they knew about that product and all the risks. And then at the end of this whole process, they were shocked at how much they didn't know and how many problems were still residing in the code. One of the fun things is when you're doing this for a brand new product, then you start with all of the must-work features and functionality. like the workflow. What workflow has to work every time? And then you go off all of the what could go wrong with that. And then you go from the highest risk all the way down to the bottom. And that's for a brand new product or system. Where it gets really fun is if you have an existing product and they want to make a couple key changes to the code, you go through this exact same process. But what's fun is when you have the developers in the room and you say, okay, here's a feature we're adding because you're using object-oriented code. The result of object-oriented code is typically defects appear in what we call clumps, right? If you find one defect around a function, you're going to find a bunch more because of the way it was built. So as we would go through and say, okay, we're adding this feature, it's going to interact with some of this code here. You get the developer and you say, okay, we're touching this code. Please tell us all the features and functions that are potentially impacted by this specific code change. And then they rattle off, well, that feature might, this function, that button, this, and then you go do the same process around all of those features. Well, you know what I mean? All the what if, because now you've affected it. You've touched code that potentially impacts this functionality. So then you attack all that because that creates new hidden defects. And that's when the developers in the room, because we're mirroring an existing system, but it was changing the functionality because of that. And then we went through that last process, getting the developers to go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. That was like epiphany. It was fun to watch all the lights go on in the room. And so you've created all these scenarios. And then as one of the gentlemen was recommending is you then have the impact versus probability. And that's the 4-quadrant process that I want to show you right here.
This looks interesting. And the page before, how many more slides do you have? Because I want to hit them at least before the top of the hour and some people drop off.
I think like 3 or 4 more.
Okay. You want to take us back a slide or you want to keep on that one? Up to you.
Oh, you ready to go?
Yeah, do the thing.
Okay, so this was basically it. You go Google it. This is what you see for impact versus probability. Now, the key of this is you've narrowed everything down. You've got this quadrant and you've listed all the scenarios. And this is before you create the test cases from the scenarios. All you care about is high impact right here, whether it's high or low probability, because that's the hidden critical defect that's going to kill you after release. You need to mitigate that risk now. All the low impact, whether it's high probability or not, like I have an example here, the help section in the font, it's the wrong color. People are most likely going to find it, but who cares? There's no risk to it. And by the way, all the low impact ones are most likely covered by existing verification and validation anyway. So the system I was testing, as an example, we finished that thing we started in the beginning of 2014. It was about a 1.5-year project. When it shipped, it went to 4 sites in the EU, what they called limited sites, because they were introducing this system. And that was delivered on site. They had an initial configuration issue because when you build these systems, you have like hardware requirements, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody installed it on a computer that wasn't up to what it would need for the power. So they're having configuration. So then they get rid of that, put in the right hardware. System ran fine. All 4 sites are still running today. No defects, running like a charm. And I have a resource at CareFusion, which is now BD, as my reference for that. I was very happy that went out. And by the way, the guy that gave me the permission to do this was very happy because it made the company look really good. And that is the end of my presentation.
Well, you said 3 or 4 more. That was quick.
I thought there was.
See that coming. Hey, Luke, what have you got?
One of the problems I always see with, I shall lower my hand. One of the problems I see with FMEA is that it uses a term like risk priority number. And the risk priority number is a multiplication of the occurrence, the probability of detection. You make a scale for the occurrence, you make a scale for the severity and a scale for the detection. But you multiply with different scales. So one scale can be exponential, 1 in 100, 1 in 10,000, 1 in a million. And the other scale can be linear. And if you just multiply them, you get to different results. Because sometimes you say, okay, we have this risk priority number, but it doesn't make sense. So what then happens is that people start to just tweak a little with their occurrence, or they twist a little bit with their severity. It's not that bad at all, just to get on an acceptable risk priority number.
Yep.
And if you go for a famous author like Eli Bahai, he sold a lot of books, and he had a LinkedIn. Let's see, what did he wrote on LinkedIn? It was that you have something like a LinkedIn thing with you have a risk priority number for risks, and he also tried to make something like that for benefits, because you have to do a risk benefit analysis, and then you have a great number for risk, but there's no great number for benefits. So he also made something that you can multiply, but it has the same flaw that you multiply things with different scales. So we do a lot of FMEA, and yes, it finds a lot of things, but I don't think it's useful, but it's not all. And also about finding defects in how people use things. The 60601 requires that you do usability of FMEA equipment. It's the 60601-1-6. So it already requires you to do everything, to test everything you do with your product with actual users. But I guess Kris, the software guys don't see those standards, so they just program along. And what you say is, so we change this piece of code, what happens there? What you then don't detect is you have a piece of code that has a certain buffer in your hardware, and then you change your code and you don't have to click that, oh, then I must increase my buffer. You get buffer overflows. So a lot of times the software changes are not detected with just seeing what's connected and then test the happy path again. But it also it always happens when something usually happens, and then you get a buffer overflow.
See, and that unusual,
that's my 2 cents.
That unusual happened is where all those defects come from. It's either somebody, and this is the famous thing I used to hear all the time. Well, you're not supposed to use it that way. Well, did you stop to look what happens if someone does? No, because they didn't sit there with a nurse and say, well, I would actually do this or that with the device. Well, that's none of the user guide, so why would I even care about that? You had to get the operational side, the nurses, the doctors, the folks that actually use the equipment to tell you how they're really going to use it. And then that input can go into your scenario-based, but that's how you find those hidden critical defects. And I can promise you, most teams don't look for those. They go through, like you said, the usability, the risk analysis. And my proof is, if all those processes that are there now worked so well, why do new entries go to the FDA recall list every single week? Go look at it. And it goes back, and then you can see the same problem appears over decades. It's just different companies because they don't talk to each other, because they're not looking for the unknown or weird or unexpected problems. They're looking for what's in the requirements, and then they test around that. They don't look for the abnormal, and that's where they get their butt kicked. It's pretty amazing. And had I not been through that experience with KPMG, I would be doing the same thing as everybody else because I would be unaware. So yeah, it's interesting. And I like how you said how FMEA, they add different number values. Ours is real simple. It's either high risk or low risk. That's all it is, as far as that feature, because you're just breaking a feature, right? But if it's a feature that has to work no matter what, that elevates the risk. So there's no number. It's either high or low. So it can't be manipulated, but I can imagine, and you could manipulate if you said, well, if they don't get surgery on the head a certain way, is the risk a 9 or a 3? So I could see.
Yeah, you sometimes see scales with up to 10 levels, and then you get discussion. Is it a level 5 or level 6? Who cares?
And that's crazy to me. It's either high risk or it's not.
Yeah.
Just so we can get to know our new friends a little better, Michael, tell us how today's presentation resonated with you. Is it a lot of the stuff that you work on?
So yeah, I've had a bit of experience with risk management in the different companies. It's interesting hearing people talk about their different experiences. I just want to throw out one really quick thing. We all use FMEA every day. My wife gets on me all the time because I'm so negative. She wants to go to the store or go to this place at this time. Well, if we do this, we're going to hit this much traffic. I'm doing risk management. So we all practice risk management every day. So yes, it's a relevant discussion. I've got a lot of experience in using the risk tables, and part of it is I agree. There's having the high and low risks and impacts is important, but you also have to be compliant. So you come up with the risk tables that make sense for your organization and get the numbers that are relevant for your organization. And yes, we've had all those discussions. Is it a 3 or a 4? Is it a high probability or low probability? So yes. Relevant.
Well, when you talked about traffic, you earned a thumbs up from Maren, so I guess that's your official welcome to the group. Juha, could you tell us a bit about how this relates to you over there in Helsinki?
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm just about to start usability studies for our next version of our infrared-based thermography system. So I've been working for a couple of weeks really on 14971 risk analysis and mitigations and picking them up to our usability studies. So
I know a guy.
Interesting talk today.
Do you have Chris, you want to put up your contact information again?
Sure.
Ms. Bushman, you decided to come on. I invited and invited and invited.
Well, so just so you know, I know it's very rare for anybody to see me be quiet, but I'm in audit prep mode. So that's the most silence you'll see when I'm prepping for things. But first off, I can attest that Michael does risk management for everything because I work with him. It's fun and sometimes annoying. And then also, not only do I use risk, without knowing it, I too use risk management and everything, but I also use root cause. I think root cause and risk management almost go together. Can you hear? Did I come through?
Yep. No, you did. We're just Chris is sharing screen of you, so we got like many versions of you. That was good.
Yeah. So I just kind of think that's something that people don't realize, because when you're doing risk management, you're inherently also doing root cause, in my viewpoint.
Okay. And now you've explained Michael's appearance. I guess you're responsible for a +1.
I'm always responsible for some +1.
Fair enough. Before we close today, Sue, what are you doing tomorrow?
I'm getting ready for a wedding. My son's getting married this weekend.
Ooh, sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Are we going to get, will you share a photo of the mother of the bride, and maybe just for fun this, next week, so we can see how dolled up you were?
Yeah.
What color dress are you going to be wearing?
Shout out the mother of the groom.
Oh, pardon me, yes.
Yeah. Gold, probably gold. And
probably, you're not sure to the stitch sure. What you're wearing tomorrow?
It's been sitting in my closet for months.
Okay. Congratulations.
I just had to try to lose 5 pounds, but yeah.
How'd that go? You don't have to share. That's a HIPAA thing. That's also coming along?
Yeah.
So we have today.
We have today. It's always a work in progress, right? Ask any woman.
Fair enough. Next week, Bijan will talk to us more about risk. Kris, thank you for today. Thank you, everyone, for making my week brighter. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Oh, and happy Halloween for those who observe candy. Bye now.
Bye-bye.